So thank you for coming, everyone, to this event today. My name's Cass, and today we'll be talking about the impact of discrimination and colonization on paleontology. Just a bit of housekeeping. I plan to talk for about maybe 50 minutes to 1 hour. That will be followed by a Q&A session and a discussion where everyone is welcome to partake and participate in. However, if people do have questions in the meantime, please do put them in the chat. Some of our moderators will either inform me and I'll be able to answer the question as we go along, or if you also like, please raise your hand and I'll be able to answer your question if you'd like to ask it verbally. So without much further ado, we'll get started. So a bit of background. Always technological lags. So I'm a PhD student at the Natural History Museum and UCL in London. I'm studying the theropod neuroanatomy, so studying their brain and their sensory capabilities. I've had equality, diversity and inclusion work within industry and academia, and I'm also the founder of Paleontologists Against Systemic Racism. So a bit of the background on the topic in terms of the impact of colonization and bias within paleontology. So currently there is actually a global crisis in terms of people studying geosciences from an ethnic minority background. So for example, within the UK, we have a 16.6% ethnic minority background. However, those studying the geosciences, which also includes paleontology, is about 3.8%, which is significantly lower. And actually paleontology within the UK is even lower than that. And we are talking about here a global field. So we're talking about a field that has no disposition or sort of preference for any ethnic minority group. It's something which is very global by its nature. And actually some of the best sites in the world are from the global south, so Africa, Brazil, or the global east, such as China. So this lack of ethnic diversity within the geosciences and paleontology is quite severe and needs to be addressed. And there have been many studies and papers based on that. And this actually impacts our understanding of the history of life on Earth and sort of the narrative around evolution and paleontology as a whole. So currently, I'll go through a couple of examples in more detail, but the history of life on Earth and its representation is heavily focused from an Anglosphere point of view, which is the point of view of North America and of Europe. And I will use the poster children of paleontology, which are the dinosaurs. A lot of people do get involved or really interested into paleontology because of the dinosaurs, especially as kids. However, there obviously are many other creatures and fauna and biota present. And I think one of the really good examples of this is our understanding of the KPG extinction, which is the late Cretaceous extinction event which wiped out all the non-avian dinosaurs, most popularly known by the asteroid impacting the Earth. So there was a recent study in 2001, which is just last year, and they published sort of the number of sites and the research that had been done and the localities of the sites. And unsurprisingly from my point of view, but maybe for those who don't know, the majority of the sites just before the extinction event was mainly focused in North America. And this would really skew our understanding of what was happening just prior to the extinction. But also, just prior to the extinction, but also when we look at it from the point of recovery. So there's been quite a bit of work done on the late Cretaceous extinction. Hold on 1 second. Someone just requested this transcript. There's been a lot of work done on the KPG extinction and the recovery after the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct. And if it's all focused on North America, you are excluding probably about 75% of the world's landmass. And the situation, and we'll go into this in more detail, the biota and the ecosystems of North America were significantly different from the rest of the world, especially Gondwana. And we'll go through a couple of case studies, some being the sauropods, which are the long-necked dinosaurs, as well as the perception of the horned dinosaurs, such as ceratopsians and the duckbills, as well as Tyrannosaurus rex. So next slide. I'll change that in 1 second. There we go. So the poster children, the sauropods. So sauropods have often been seen as sort of the very dinosaur that embodies all we see and understand of dinosaurs. They were massive. They were significantly present during the Jurassic in North America, made famous by many species such as Diplodocus, Apatosaurus, Brachiosaurus, and Brontosaurus, many of which appear in Jurassic Park movies, in many of the early movies such as The Lost World, and many children can really point them out. However, what's very interesting is the narrative around them. So in many kids' books, the narrative is that they flourished and they dominated Jurassic, which is true in North America. However, they went extinct at the end of the Jurassic and were replaced by the horned dinosaurs and the ceratopsians. Now, this is true in North America. They did survive into the early Cretaceous, but for argument's sake and for simplicity, we can argue, say, they did go extinct at the end of the Jurassic. However, and this is where the however is really emphasized, it was always portrayed, and there's many kids' book and popular science books which really say, look, they were replaced by the horned dinosaurs and the ceratopsians. So we're talking about those like Triceratops, which is quite a well-known dinosaur, as well as those like Parasaurolophus, which Chris Pratt is lassoing in the recent Jurassic World Dominion trailer, for those who don't know. However, this is not the case in the rest of the world, excluding North America and Europe. So we're talking about around 70 to 75% of the landmass, the sauropods did not go extinct. However, they didn't just not go extinct, they also flourished and they really prospered within Gondwana. So we're talking about continents such as South America, Africa, Madagascar, India, Australia, and they were also present in Antarctica. So they really flourished and they really dominated, and they were, just like they were in the Jurassic, within North America, keystone species. So they really shaped and dominated their ecosystems. Now, I had a kids' books, and there's actually many kids' books, so from say the 90s, around that time, and even more recent ones when I've looked into them, which state, they have the sauropods sort of went extinct and they survived. And this is actually more or less, I'm paraphrasing, but more or less what the quote was, but they survived in remote parts of the world, such as Argentina. Now, as a kid reading that, it actually emphasizes a few things in very few words. First of all, it really isolates and makes Argentina seem like a distant and isolated place. Secondly, because of the narrative that is surrounded in the rest of the book, which is talking about the sauropod replacement by hadrosaurs and ceratopsian, the horned and duck-billed dinosaurs, it makes it seem like what's happening in Argentina is unique. It is also there's also the ramification that is quite a primitive place as well, and this we'll touch on later because there are many examples of the narrative surrounding the dinosaurs and other ecologies and species which infers that their presence makes a land or landmass or continents primitive, and sort of an evolutionary backwater. However, not just affecting the kids, because they may feel like, okay, Argentina is not important in terms of the fossils, or it's sort of something unique and sort of very primitive, so we shouldn't really be talking about them. The book does obviously negates the importance of most of Gondwana, because the sauropods were really key stone taxa. And the issue here is that this is not like a recent discovery. So we're not talking about like a sampling bias. So from the 1880s, sauropod bones were discovered in India. In the 1920s, 1930s, we had Cretaceous sauropods being discovered in South America. In the 1950s, there were also sauropods discovered in Mongolia, and some of the biggest dinosaurs ever actually were discovered in the late 1980s in Argentina. So we're not talking about a new phenomenon or a new issue here that it's a recent discovery. For example, feathered dinosaurs, which were only discovered in China in 1996. We're talking about dinosaurs that have been known for well over 100 years, their presence, and they had a global distribution. However, due to their lack of appearance in the late Cretaceous in North America, the narrative is that this is unimportant, and they are often sidelined in many of the books, and they were replaced by more advanced dinosaurs. And this is unlike, for example, the Stegosaurus issue, or Stegosaur issue, apologies, where Stegosaurs survived into the Cretaceous in South America and other parts of Gondwana after they had been subsequently made extinct in North America. So again, there is a bias, and there is a narrative that is being spun, which really puts the emphasis of what is important and what is not important. And here again, the whole idea is that what happened in North America is the pinnacle of evolution. So in many of the books, and even, for example, within Walking with Dinosaurs, which is an amazing series and really groundbreaking at its time, there was this idea that the more primitive sauropods were replaced by the more advanced ceratopsians and horned dinosaurs, due to the evolution of flowering plants and other newer forms of plants. However, again, this is very focused on what's happening in North America, and it does not represent the rest of the world, even though there had been numerous expeditions, and we'll go into that subsequently, in other parts of the world to explore their biota and their fossils, many of which were then transported back to North America and Europe. And everyone's favorite, or many people's favorites, Tyrannosaurus does have a role to play in all of this. So I'm sure even from those who don't really like dinosaurs, many people could tell me, or the general public as well, could tell me many interesting facts about T-Rex. For example, it has really short arms, how fast it could run. It was one of the biggest predators on land of all time. It had a very strong bite force, and it could not, Claire could not outrun it in high heels in Jurassic World. So T-Rex has a very, very wide popular appeal, and is present within within the general public's knowledge, and that is actually one of the most studied geniuses or species of animal ever, even more than many extant species as well. So it's been highly studied, and the general public knows and loves it very much. However, so recently, I think there's an issue which really highlighted this. So in the recent, really well-received documentary, Prehistoric Planet, there was actually an online backlash that T-Rex had become too woke. And people started criticizing it because, for one, it seemed to have feathers, and two, the male Tyrannosaurus was looking after the children. Now, this isn't the only example, but people have put their sort of ideas and ideologies onto prehistoric faunas, and they have become symbols. So for many people, people say, oh no, T-Rex is like this big, scary monster. It had no feathers. It's, it didn't look after the kids. It was just like this monster that goes around destroying things. Now, obviously, what we understood about dinosaurs 20 years ago, 50 years ago is very different from what we understand now. Paleontology is very often evolving and changing, and therefore, with new evidence, people come up with new theories. However, that does not prevent people still using them, dinosaurs, as well as other fauna, as symbols. And T-Rex had become a symbol for a small group of people, at least, to show what some would argue is toxic masculinity. And that is why there was this idea, are you making T-Rex woke? Now, a very interesting fact about Tyrannosaurus that is not discussed, and definitely not within the public sphere at least, is that Tyrannosaurus's direct ancestors did not come from North America, but it came from Asia. However, T-Rex is often seen as T-Rex is often seen as a purely North American dinosaur. Now, with that in mind, if people understood that what has been shown as a sort of North American icon to many, Tyrannosaurus, was actually a migrant from Asia, and that throughout the history of life on Earth, there has been constant movement of species, and in more recent time, movement of humans. The idea of immigration, the idea of migration, would actually paint a very different picture to what is being often portrayed within the media, and that may actually help to understand more empathy and actually make us come together stronger as humans, because unfortunately there are lots of social injustices and lots of narratives that have been pushed out, especially in the last few years, that are very divisive. Now, if we did understand the role of T-Rex and that it actually was a migrant and that it's not a purely North American taxa, as it were, or animal, but it was actually from Asia, and that there is this migration, I think that would have a big impact on people's understanding, and actually would make it would help to, I think, bring people together. However, that narrative is excluded, and therefore you get people using it for their own ends, as it were. Now, on to the next slide. This comes to this idea of age of empires. So there's a very famous story, or a very well-known expedition, sorry, let me put it that way, in Tanzania in the early 20th century to a location called Tengaru Beds. And the Germans led it initially, and they found at the time what was known as Brachiosaurus, subsequently renamed as Giraffatitan, and it was for a long time one of the biggest dinosaurs in the world. And what the Germans did was use it to justify, and I think many empires were doing this. But if we take a step back, and I think this is interesting, so the Germans land on the Sado coast of Tanzania, just for argument's sake. This location is about 40 miles inland. And we're talking about before the days of GPS, satellite phones, and so forth. So this location is 40 miles inland. Now, 40 miles is a long way to cross savannah, to cross, you would have dangerous animals such as lions and leopards, hyenas, actually very dangerous, as well as animals such as hippos and crocodiles. And you also have the issues of trying to find fresh water. Now, they had to rely on the locals. And you can see in the top right and top image there that many locals actually helped with the expedition, but also would have had to lead the Germans to the fossil locality site, because there's no way you could argue that the Germans turned up and found this site with some of the most spectacular fossils, definitely from Africa at the time, and even in more recent years. They just turned up and found them. The locals led them to this site because the locals were aware of it. The locals often held the fossils in reverence, and they saw it as a special and sacred place. and they would have done much of the manual labor to extract the fossils. However, in many of the books and in many of the narratives, the use and the efforts of the locals are often excluded. Now, taking this even further, is that one of the dinosaurs, which is now named the Dicryosaurus, which is the one, the smaller sauropod long neck one, was supposed to be named after one of the local people. However, this was denied and named after a German instead. And again, this isn't sort of the only example, but there was a clear effort to try to eradicate the use and the role of the native people within paleontology and their importance. However, the Germans didn't just leave it at this point. It actually goes on further. And what mainly happened is this. During the time of empire, people often used their prehistoric fauna as a justification to empire. So, for example, if you had magnificent, large megafauna in your past, it showed that you were a worthy empire today. Excuse me, you were a worthy empire today. You're a worthy empire today, and this gives you justification for your existence. However, and the Germans actually, to my understanding, did use the fossils of kangaroo beds, and that's why they are even today still up in pride of place within the German museum, such as Giraffe Titan, which is the massive sauropod in sort of the main hall, one of the main halls. Now, they use it as justification for the empire. However, if we take a step back, weren't these found within the continent of Africa? Wouldn't this mean that the African people and the African continent were great? But for some reason, that logic was skipped. They passed that sort of logic, as it were. And so it was used as a justification for empire. And this actually has ramifications because at the time in the 1920s, 1930s, within Romania, it was the first example of what is known as insular dwarfism, i.e. when species were found or live on an island for a significant amount of time, they become smaller to cope with the reduced resources. And these dinosaurs, these fossils, which are of many of the small versions or dwarf-sized versions of their counterparts, mainland counterparts, were often ignored and seen as unimportant because of their small size. However, the scientists at the time, the paleontologist at the time, still went on to dig and discuss these because he was concerned with the science. But even then, it would have been seen as a matter of shame for a country to have small and minute prehistoric megafauna, as it would be deemed it would reflect badly on the people of its time. Now, there's many other examples in more recent times where people use megafauna for other social and political ends. So, for example, I think this year there was I think one of my colleagues was telling me there was a euphorian mammal from India. So this is from the Mesozoic. It was the first one discovered. Unfortunately, there was a colleague who worked on euphorian mammals, and he had passed away recently. Now, he was a very much loved colleague, and his passing is very sad. However, just to note, there was other species named after him. Now, this was the first Indian mammal named, and it was named after him. And even though that's a very sweet gesture and very touching, we do have to understand, put it in maybe some context, that he did have other species named after him. This was the first euphorian mammal discovered in India, and it wasn't named after something to do with India, but it was named after someone from the West, from North America. Now, if we put that in, if we reverse that, could you ever imagine someone from some animal being discovered in, say, Europe or North America being discovered after an ethnic minority who had no direct connection to the lands, i.e. someone from Africa or Asia. I do struggle to see that occurring. I would love to be proved wrong. But again, the issue to do with naming and entomology, so the naming of species, has a presence within the local population. So, if you named it after sort of maybe something to do more with the local people, you can get more children involved in paleontology. People become interesting. It is part of their heritage. Many people see fossils, especially now, as part of their heritage, part of their identity, part of their culture. And again, this is sort of being removed from the Indian people. And I think, that was an opportunity to really help highlight the paleontology in India. The Indian subcontinent has an amazing amount of fossils and amazing history of paleontology. However, it is significantly understudied. I know many amazing paleontologists in India who are working on this in addition to their day job to try to highlight the prehistoric fauna and biotas and ecosystems. But something like this could really could have helped push it forward. And another thing we can then talk about is the portrayal of the Ice Age extinction. So many people, I think most people, especially within the general public, are aware of stuff like mammoths and saber-toothed cats and woolly rhino. And they did exist across North America and in Europe and in parts of Asia. Now, and people are very aware of the Ice Age extinction. However, the way it is phrased is actually problematic, and actually what hasn't been studied significantly or in much detail is why megafauna in Africa and Asia survived. There are some theories out there, but there hasn't been a great amount of studies. Now, obviously, it's very important to understand why the megafauna have become extinct in these areas, in North America and Europe. Was it climate change? Was it humans? Was it a combination of both? What were the factors, especially now with the global crisis, ecological crisis we are going through? However, answering the question of why they survived within North America, within Asia and Africa, for example, could also help to provide solutions of how to protect our existing megafauna. And that has not really been studied at all. And that is actually quite a perplexing point, because the two almost go hand in hand. Why some survived and why some went extinct. And maybe answering the question of why some survived may provide a more definitive question or answer on why the others went extinct. And again, in more recent times, we have, during the Age of Empires, we have many megafauna around the world going extinct. So for example, we have the quanga, which is a subspecies of zebra. Originally it was thought to be a separate species, but it's now a subspecies of zebra. That went extinct because that was overhunted. There were cheetahs in India. There was many other megafauna around the world that had survived for thousands of years up into historical times. But during the Age of Empires, as it were, they were overhunted and they were hunted to extinction, and they would have affected the ecosystem and the biodiversity as well. So again, there's been a lot of biodiversity connected to empire, which isn't often discussed. And now we go back to this idea of the evolutionary backwater. So I did touch upon this earlier. Now, it was definitely my dream as a kid, and I think it was definitely my dream as a kid, and I think any.
Cassius, we have a question in the chat from Sean.
Okay.
Do we see similar colonial marks on Ice Age fauna fossils as we do with dinosaur fossils?
I don't believe so. I think Ice Age fossils tend to be, or what's associated with Ice Age fossils, so i.e. mammoths and saber-tooths, tend to be from North America and Europe. The sort of megafauna of Africa and Asia hasn't been studied as much. And more of the South American megafauna have, not all of it, but some of it stayed more in South America as well. So I don't think there is the same idea of people using Ice Age megafauna in the same ways that they use dinosaurs to justify the age of empires, as it were. It may be because the mammals generally were much smaller than the dinosaurs, and therefore, once people had found dinosaur bones, they weren't really surpassed by the mammals, so people use dinosaurs to still justify some of their ideas, as it were. So in terms of sort of the age, in terms of as many kids, we would love to be able to find dinosaurs in different parts of the world. And often the premise of these lost world stories, so Sir Arthur Conan Doyle story, where you go to South America to find dinosaurs, or maybe again another famous example, which is the Mokele Mbembe within the Congo of Africa. You know, we have Western explorers going to these remote parts of the world and discovering dinosaurs, you know, from prehistoric times. As a kid, that's an amazing story. It's like, yes, dinosaurs are still with us. You can find them in remote parts of the world. However, there's a very colonial backdrop to those stories and underlying premise. So in the early 20th century, so around 1910s, this was during the height of Dinomania, by the way. So similarly, subsequently afterwards, it was when sort of you were getting more of Loch Ness monster sightings. There was this whole idea that there were saurians in Africa. So the giant dinosaurs survived in Africa, and you can find them deep in the jungle. Now, the premise of this, however, which isn't discussed, is that they were still present in Africa because Africa was an evolutionary backwater where primitive man fought off, where Stone Age man fought off the giant saurians with stone arrowhead and spear. And that's why they were still there, because there had been no evolution and it was isolated and it was a backwater. And what's often reflected is when the animals are seen as an evolutionary backwater, so are its people. And this is also true for Australia, where Australian mammals, for example, are often portrayed as primitive, and this goes on to the indigenous people of Australia as well. So the premise of the Lost World has quite a racial undertone. It says more about the people, the implications on the people, on how primitive they are, and really, you know, that there's been no evolution, and therefore, you know, we are coming there, and we are bringing knowledge and expertise, and trying to, you know, that whole, are we trying to help the native savages, which is completely unacceptable in today's view, but it was actually very present less than 100 years ago, as it were. Next slide to move. Technology. Here we go. And then this moves on to the topic of scientific racism. Now, scientific racism is the idea of using pseudoscience. Okay, there's a question here. Yes, no, that's a very good example. So
sorry, we have another question in the chat from Alan. When US was considered a colonial backwater, Thomas Jefferson used mastodon fossils to boost North America's status against European opinion.
Yes, so that again, that is a good example of when people are using fossils to try and boost status among one another. So thank you for sharing that. And then in terms of scientific racism, it's the idea of using pseudoscience to justify the greatness of one race over another. So, for example, we have characters such as Roy Chapman Andrews, Henry Fairfield Osborn, and Ernest Haeckel, who found the idea that they were that white people were descended from people from Africa, i.e. Black people, so abhorrent that they sent expeditions to Central Asia to find early human remains to prove that they were descended from people from Asia. So they found it so completely sickening in their views that they could not be descended from Black people, that they went to Asia to find some more dinosaur bones, to find some more fossils of early humans to show that, this is our theory. So they believed in sort of out of Asia theory and criticized Darwin and other people for thinking that humans all came from Africa. And they also used there's also other justifications they were going into. So they were saying, for example, and maybe I should issue a trigger warning because some of this language may be upsetting to some, that the Negro, they have a more flexible sort of toes and feet. And this is evidence that they are more primitive because the apes use their toes and feet to swing from tree to tree, and they are more primitive. Example. So people were actually really trying to use biology to justify racism and the dominance of one race over the other. And actually, this expedition to Asia, it failed to discover any human remains. However, it discovered some amazing dinosaur remains. So this is sort of when they went to the Gobi Desert and discovered amazing bones of dinosaurs such as Velociraptor, Oviraptor, and many of the famous sort of dinosaurs at the time, as it were. And they went back on numerous occasions. However, what's rarely discussed is the motivation and the driver for this expedition to Asia, as it were, and why they went there, and that some of these dinosaurs, some of these favorites, like Velociraptor, is now a household name because of Jurassic Park, was actually founded and discovered based on racism. And it actually even relates now to T-Rex, because Osborne, he was the one who described T-Rex, and again, he was not a very nice character. Many of these, alongside many of his contemporaries who shared his ideas, they had deep racist ideas. They also had many anti-Semitic ideas. They believed in eugenics, and they weren't nice characters. However, this is not really discussed, and sort of discovery and naming of T-Rex and of Velociraptor and the other Mongolian fossils are rarely discussed or put into any sort of context. And some of these people are still looked up to today because they were sort of the original, quote unquote, Indiana Jones when they were going off into these expeditions, going to uncharted parts of the world and to discover dinosaurs and the like. So again, there's a real, even when it comes to dinosaurs and some of these really famous ones, there is a really deep underlying racial, racist background, unfortunately, which isn't discussed. And I think it's really important to discuss them because, that expedition may not have discovered, if that expedition didn't go to Central America, you may not have discovered many of these fossils, as it were. And then there's the ongoing impact of colonization, which you can argue now is colonialism, and so neocolonialism. And this topic in and of itself is a huge topic, so I'm only going to go over it briefly. We do have a recording where we discussed this issue for about 2 hours and 45 minutes, was one of our other events. So this is a massive topic. So I'll just give a brief overview for those who weren't present for that. So for example, there is a big global north, global south divide. How our colleagues, many good colleagues and many good scientists in the global south, their work isn't really respected or seen on the same level. There's a big issue of what is known as parachute science. So people from, say, the global north coming to the global south or global east, extracting the fossils, extracting the specimens, giving very little back, but then getting the reward of having these rare, unique fossils. They're getting the top papers in the top journals, but the local people lose the fossils because they often come back to the global north. They're not benefiting future generations of paleontologists or other scientists because they're not there to study. The local economies don't get the benefit of people going to them to visit the fossils. However, they have to go across the world to study their own fossils, as it were. Again, there's many issues to do with illegally exported fossils. So I think one of the most publicized, or sorry, one of the most politicized dinosaurs is Ubijara, which is the one with those bizarre and unique feathers. It was illegally exported from Brazil. It's the first feathered dinosaur specimen discovered from Gondwana, or the southern continents, ever. And it was illegally exported to Germany, and therefore it's not been able to be studied by the local people. It's a dinosaur that would be very sought after to study. After sort of the community backlash and unrest, it was the paper which was published was retracted. So Ubijara was no longer a scientifically valid name, which is good, but unfortunately the fossil still remains in Germany, and it really does need to go back to Brazil, and people are not giving up, which is good, and people are still raising their voices so the fossil can go back to Brazil. Another issue is this understanding and predicting climate change and the ecological change and collapse, as it were. So for example, going forward, we have, with the increase in temperature or global temperature, the risk to ecosystems, ecosystem stability, and collapse and change is often purely based on taxa and fauna and ecosystems from North America. You can't extrapolate what happens in North America to the rest of the world. North America has very different ecosystems, especially prehistorically, as it were, to Gondwana. And therefore, if we were to study different parts of the world, we would have a better understanding and better be able to predict changes for the future, as it were. And as previously mentioned, this ongoing effect prevents the development of the global south and the global east in terms of their paleontology, their scientists, because many people do get into science because of things like dinosaurs, because people, students nowadays, Jurassic Park did have a big part to play in it. It did open people up to science and paleontology. They may go and study very different science and do very different degrees, but the popular media and culture, going to museums, going to see fossils, going to see, example, Dippy in Natural History Museum in London as a kid did really impact myself and many others. So this does really these fossils do really help to shape the future. And also there's something which I coined the term minority tax. I did not come up with it, but I think it's a very good description. So for example, minorities, not just ethnic minorities, but any minority often faces disadvantages within academia, as well as in many other walks of life. So that's one tax. However, they're then also often burdened to do the majority of the work to do with equality, diversity, and inclusion, and outreach, which is then a double tax. And we all hate taxes, so you get taxed once, you get hardly anything. Imagine getting taxed twice, there'd be virtually nothing left. So that is, in summary, what I did want to talk about. So thank you for listening, and please feel free to ask any questions. And we're more than happy to have an open dialogue and discussion now. So thank you for listening, and please ask any question or raise your hand, as it were. Maria.
Oh no, sorry, I was just,
Okay.
this was just clapping. Thank you so much for this talk.
You're welcome. Rose, okay, hi. Alice.
Hi, sorry,
Hi.
I clicked the wrong button.
Okay, no.
So first of all, really good talk, thank you. I was kind of thinking, and I've been thinking recently, about how we can apply the lessons that we're currently learning from decolonizing fieldwork in secondary data analysis.
Yeah.
And obviously the first thing is to involve people from the countries of origin of the data. But I also wanted to ask if you or anyone else has any further ideas or.
No, that's a really good question. So I think when I've spoken to colleagues, for example, the Palaeontology database, which is a really great resource, often the data from the Global South is highly incomplete. It's highly incomplete, and also a lot of the material that isn't necessarily published in English doesn't get into the database. So there needs to be, I think, a much greater effort to collaborate with colleagues to be able to use published information in different languages to create more holistic data sets. And with more holistic data sets, we would then be able to have better analyses going forward, but it will take time and effort. I think it definitely needs more of a interchange of various parties and a much more acknowledgement that there is a heavy bias within something within paleontology, because when people think of animals and dinosaurs, it's sort of hard sometimes to make the jump that there would be sort of biases, because these are sort of wild animals and they don't have a concept of, for example, racism or discrimination, as it were.
Definitely. I was more thinking about the sets where we have the data and it's a complete set, let's say, from South America.
Okay. Yeah.
How we can make sure that if we, in the course of our research, end up doing secondary data analysis on those kind of things, that we actually collaborate with the locals, maybe do more translations and that kind of stuff, to reiterate your point.
No, apologies. I misunderstood the question. No, that's if you would, I think collaborating with people from South America, especially those who contribute to the data set, would be great, because one, you having that exchange of knowledge, so you have a skill, and those in the Global South have a skill, and you can train each other, you can train students and exchange that knowledge. So you, one, incorporating them, but it's also collaborating them on equitable terms, so they're actually authors or co-authors, because often or sometimes people, when they do collaborate, they don't from the Global South, they don't often get authorship. They maybe get an acknowledgement. So I think one, it is really important to collaborate on equitable terms and have this idea about exchange of knowledge. We may have more practice, say, in processing data, but they have more knowledge on the fossil than on the taxa. And if we can exchange that, then we make paleontology stronger as a whole. And many colleagues, especially in the Global South, are very willing to collaborate. I've spoken to many, and they're always very happy to collaborate, and they're very knowledgeable and very accommodating as well, and very helpful.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have a comment from Keshav. I don't know, maybe you want to read it out and comment to it.
One thing I really liked about Prehistoric Planet was how it showed animals from all over the planet with a certain care, and in a way that makes the planet feels connected, as opposed to having North American remote locations. I do agree with that. Prehistoric Planet, that's the recent documentary on Apple TV. I do highly recommend you watch it. I found it was really amazing, and I was so pleasantly surprised to see some of the fauna and dinosaurs and biota named. There was really a global distribution. It is based on the very latest Cretaceous, so a couple of million years around the extinction event, but they did really have an amazing global distribution. They had fauna that I knew as a kid and I loved as a kid because they were unique. For example, the hadrosaur from South America was one example. And I think it was amazing they showed that, and I was like, oh my gosh, they had this dinosaur. And that, you know, I think that ability to show and highlight fauna from around the world would really help people feel that paleontology is really a global field. So I think that was amazing, and hopefully there'll be more series like that going forward, as it were.
Oh, there is a comment or question from Emma.
Yeah. So in terms, so there's many papers out there. There's a really big one, just 2021, by Rajab et al. About colonization and impact. I'm paraphrasing here, but it's how the biodiversity, or our understanding of biodiversity, is impacted by bias and discrimination. So that's highly recommended. There are many other papers along that nature. I recommend there, and they would cite other papers. I think that was quite a well-known one. And the other ones are often my observations or just historical information. So you could read up about characters such as Roy Andrew Chapman. The observations of the sauropods are sort of my observations going through many books, as it were, and that would be slightly harder to cite. But there is more and more topics about decolonization in paleontology. So a quick Google search would help, but also feel free to reach out to me, and I can point anyone who wants to in the right direction on more specific areas. And if I don't know, I can probably recommend colleagues who will be able to help you more in your specific area of interest as well. Sure, 2 questions.
Yeah, I was just going to ask for more questions or comments, but Keshav is typing, it looks like, but feel free to unmute yourself. Or anyone else, raise your hands or write into the chat box, which apparently takes some time.
The typing can take some time, so it's fine. But not everyone's always able to talk, so we appreciate you typing.
Yeah, at this point, I think it's okay to just unmute yourself and ask your question if you have it, even if you're too shy to raise your hand. I think that will be fine. The first question just arrived. Where will be the access?
We do hope to upload it, and then we can share it with people. We can share it via the mailing list. So we do hope to upload it, and hopefully it will be accessible in the future on YouTube.
So Maria, in the meantime, Maria has a question.
This is just following up from what you said, Cass. Is there already, is the video from
sorry, what was the question?
That previous meeting where you discussed you mentioned that that previous meeting, and there was a recording of it.
Yes.
Is that already available online?
Yeah, that's available online. It's called Bias, Discrimination, and Decolonialism Paleontology. It's in 2 parts. Part 1 is the main talk, and then the second part is the discussion that we continue. So yeah, that is available on YouTube. If anyone would like that, I can just reach out to me and I can send you the link, as it were.
Amazing, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes.
So the question is, what would you recommend that we can do to resolve the issues present here? That's a really good question. I think 1, if we are researchers, be it early career, mid, late students, to work and collaboratively with colleagues around the world, because sometimes there is this whole separate discussion, but I'll touch on it briefly. This idea of intersectionality, that people have different privileges and disprivileges or disadvantages, as it were. And we may not always have the same experience, but often when people who don't necessarily identify with some of our characteristics speak up for us, it has a massive impact on other people around us. So I think one is to work collaboratively with people from the region where, if you are studying, say, fossils from the Global South, try to reach out with people from the Global South. Try to have an equitable idea in terms of, okay, let's try to exchange knowledge. Let's try to teach up local paleontologists, students from younger generations. I think the second thing is to acknowledge that bias, so that science can still have a bias, and that there is a narrative that is spun around science, especially paleontology, and try to look at it more holistically, especially if you're talking about trends or sort of the evolution of life on Earth, and so forth, to have that, to have those discussions, to look at it differently. Many paleontology associations are working to increase diversity, not just of ethnic minorities, but all minorities. So we've got SVP, PALAS, EAVP, to reach out with them as well, because they're always looking for more volunteers. There's, paleontologists against systemic racism is again there to work against systemic racism within paleontology. Talk to colleagues, support people when, and this goes, if anyone sees an injustice or someone being treated badly, stand up for them. You don't have to be the most eloquent person ever. You may stammer, you might stutter, you may not even say much of a word, but for people who treat others badly, that mere standing up often has a massive impact. And it may not feel like anything changes at the time, but when people have stood up for others who may be from a different race or not identify as a racial minority, or female colleagues have said, you know what, I wish a male colleague stood up for me then, or a male colleague did stand up for me then, and that made a real big impact. So we can stand up for one another. It will take time, but I think it's about having these dialogues, about understanding the history of paleontology, because paleontology was really forged and born in its modern form, at least, during the Age of Empires, during the Victorian, or just prior to the Victorian era. And, people were aware of fossils beforehand. You have texts going from like 900 AD mentioning fossils as well. So that is important as well, to understand sort of the history of paleontology. But there is a lot we can do. It's not necessarily always easy, but it's the right thing to do. And I think it would make paleontology not just more accessible, but make it more holistic in our understanding of it as well, and also help for the future in terms of future climate change as well, if we had a more holistic understanding of diversity and changes over time. And yes, thanks, Maxim. The link's been posted as well. Anyone have any other questions or comments? We'll just give it a couple more minutes if anyone has any more comments or questions to add. Last minute. There's never a bad question as well.
Yeah, looks like people are ready for dinner or wherever they are in the world, and maybe for a different meal.
Yes, no, that's true. Well, thank you for coming, everyone. It's much appreciated. Please feel free to reach out if you have any future questions or have any ideas. And many paleontologists around the world are always willing to improve things and are always willing to listen and collaborate. So do reach out and do ask around. And many paleontologists are very good at pointing to the right people if they don't know the answer as well. So there is positivity there, and I think we need to remember that, and we need to work together for a better tomorrow of not just ourselves but of everyone. So thanks for coming, everyone, and have an amazing day, evening, morning, or afternoon, depending on the part of the world you are from. So thanks again, and have a great day. Thanks a lot.